The rain had only just eased when Claire unlatched the farmhouse door, expecting the quiet stillness of the aftermath. Instead, she froze in place. Mason Hart stood on her porch-soaked hat dripping, shoulders broad beneath his wet denim jacket, boots caked in mud, and eyes carrying something he'd never dared say aloud. For a heartbeat, she simply stared at him, unsure whether the sight of him there startled her or comforted her more. His presence always had a way of quieting the noise in her chest. She stepped back slightly, gripping the doorframe. "Cowboy, what are you doing here?" she asked, voice softer than she intended. Mason shifted his weight, holding his hat against his chest as politely as ever. His hair was damp, a strand falling over his forehead. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "Storm hit your side harder than ours." His tone was steady, but there was concern beneath it, warm and unmistakably genuine. Claire glanced out toward the dark stretch of land behind him. The storm had torn through that distance with fury, yet he had still come. A long, lonely ache unfurled inside her, an ache she had ignored for too long. The thought that someone cared enough to cross that storm for her made her throat tighten. The wind brushed through the wet grass, carrying the faint smell of rain and earth. Everything outside felt unsettled, but the sight of Mason standing there made the world feel strangely steady. He didn't move, didn't push, didn't insist. He simply waited, giving her all the space she needed. The way he always did. Lightning flickered in the far sky, briefly illuminating the fields and the edges of Mason's face. In that quick glow, Claire noticed the exhaustion around his eyes, perhaps from the storm, perhaps from something deeper. She wondered if he carried loneliness the way she did. Quietly and silently every day, she stepped aside. Enough for him to see the warm light behind her, though she didn't say the words to invite him in. Mason studied her face for a moment, cautious but hopeful. "Did the barn roof hold?" he asked gently. "Heard the wind was rough out here. I was worried it might have blown through." Claire nodded but didn't meet his gaze right away. His worry, so simple and so sincere, felt like a warmth she wasn't used to. "It held," she said softly, "though I wasn't sure it would." She tried to smile, but the storm had shaken more than just her walls. Still, Mason's presence eased something inside her. Another gust of wind swept across the porch, sending droplets scattering. Mason flinched at the cold, but stayed right where he was. Claire realized he hadn't come because he felt obligated. He came because he cared. And that realization settled gently over her like a blanket, steadying her heartbeat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full of words unspoken, feelings unadmitted, and questions neither dared ask. Claire saw it in his eyes. He'd come the second the storm passed. Not for an excuse, but because he couldn't stay away. She finally exhaled, tension melting from her shoulders. For months she had faced storms alone, the ones outside and the ones inside her. But tonight felt different. The rain-soaked cowboy standing on her porch wasn't just a visitor. He was a quiet reassurance she didn't know she needed until he arrived, and for the first time in a long while, Claire didn't feel alone. Mason's presence, solid, steady, and unexpectedly tender, filled the doorway with a sense of safety she had almost forgotten existed. Something unspoken passed between them, warm and slow, like dawn rising after a long night. She didn't invite him in with words. She didn't have to. Her eyes, softening, said enough. And Mason, dripping rain on her porch, understood perfectly. The farmhouse kitchen glowed soft and golden, the lamplight reflecting off the wooden counters and the simple metal kettle warming on the stove. Claire handed Mason a towel, her fingers brushing his for just a moment, barely a second but enough to send a warmth through both of them. Mason accepted it with that quiet, shy nod he always had, eyes lingering on her in a way he usually tried to hide. Thunder rumbled far out on the plains, deep and rolling like the earth itself was shifting. The windows rattled gently. Claire glanced toward them, listening to the wind gather strength again. "You can head back before the next wave hits," she said softly, trying to sound casual even though she didn't want him to go. There was something different about tonight, something fragile and warm. Mason looked toward the door, his shoulders rising slightly as if preparing to leave. But then he paused. Slowly he turned back to her. His jaw tightened, not in frustration, but in hesitation, in longing, in a quiet courage he rarely allowed himself to feel. His voice, when it came, was low and careful. "Claire," he said, her name almost a breath. "Do you want me to stay near you tonight?" She froze, towel still in her hand. It wasn't a demand. It was an expectation. Mason was not a man who pushed his way into anyone's life. His question was simple, but the meaning behind it ran deep. He wasn't asking for closeness. He was offering protection, warmth, comfort, presence, something she'd secretly wanted for far longer than she admitted. Her breath caught as she studied him, this cowboy who rode across fields and storms just to check on her, who spoke gently, even when soaked to the bone, who carried more kindness in silence than most men did in words. He looked almost ready to regret asking, ready to step away if she so much as blinked wrong. Claire swallowed, her heart thudding against her ribs. She stepped closer without quite realizing it. "I don't want you to ride back in that weather," she said, voice trembling only slightly. "And I wouldn't mind the company." The relief in Mason's eyes was subtle but unmistakable. He didn't smile wide, he wasn't that kind of man, but his shoulders loosened. The tension around his mouth softened, and something warm flickered in his gaze. "Then I'll stay right here," he murmured. Lightning flashed outside, lighting the fields in a stark white glow. The storm gathered its force again, wind howling along the boards of the porch. But inside, everything felt steadier, like the farmhouse itself was settling around them. Bracing against the storm. Claire moved toward the stove, pretending to fuss with the kettle just to keep her hands busy. Mason hung his wet jacket near the fire, the scent of rain and earth drifting through the room. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was full of all the times they'd met by fences, exchanged small smiles across the fields. All the nights they'd thought of each other without speaking it. When the thunder cracked again, Claire flinched. Mason stepped closer instinctively, stopping only when he was near enough for her to feel the heat radiating from him. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, even though her heart felt anything but calm. "Just the storm," she whispered. Mason hesitated only a heartbeat before lifting a hand. Slowly, carefully, he placed it over hers. Warm, steady, grounding. Claire didn't pull away. She leaned the slightest bit closer, and Mason let out a breath he'd been holding for months. Outside, the rain hammered against the roof. The storm raged, wild and merciless. But inside the farmhouse, something quiet and new settled between them, something soft, brave, and long overdue. And as the night deepened and the thunder echoed across the plains, Claire realized that Mason's staying wasn't the beginning of danger.